Greetings, everyone. This is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever, and today's video is going to be what to do. What do the rabbis say Oral Torah is? How is it defined? So the question that's going to be answered in this video is what is the definition of Oral Torah and what exactly the rabbis say it is and what it's called? So just using an example from the website of betchabad.com, just using them as one example amongst many of in Hebrew, how exactly is this term oral Torah or Torah Shebal Peh defined? And essentially what it says here is that when defining Torah Shebal Peh, it says, Hi lama'aseh hemshech yashir lachelek hama'asi shel Torah. So it's describing, for example, like the actions that one takes to do Torah. ההלכות והדינים והפרטיים שנאמרו על ידי Moshe Rabbeinu. So essentially, it's if you will, the rulings, judicial rulings, or different methodologies of doing the Torah as given by Moshe Rabbeinu, including all the details. And it says what I've listed in here in green. He nikoreth בשם תורה שבעל פה, שכן היא כוללת את הפירושים שלא נמסרו לכתיבה, אלא עברו במסורת מדור לדור. So essentially what it says here is that the things that I mentioned earlier concerning the information that Moshe Rabbeinu received from the Creator of all things, that is basically, called Torah Shebal Peh, and it basically includes all of the different pirushim, that were not written in the written text, meaning the explanation of what the written text means, and how it's to be understood and how the mitzvot that were mentioned in the written Torah are supposed to be done. And that includes things that include how to make future judgments, for example. All of those things, for example, are things that are not written in the text of the written Torah, and all of those things are considered to be Torah Shebal Peh. And I've given the definition of Torah itself, meaning instruction, directive, teaching, instruction, things like that, as the basic definition of the word itself. So when then talking about Torah Shebal Peh, this is one of the basic definitions. And it lastly says that these are things that have been passed down as a masoreth from generation to generation. So masoreth is like saying like a transmission, or almost like a message that's transmitted from generation to generation. So then the question becomes, does the Tanakh identify non-written instruction? And of course, the answer to this is yes, it does. Because as I mentioned in previous videos, when you look at Exodus 24:12, for example, there's a mention of three things that Moshe Rabbeinu was going to be given when he was going up to Mount Sinai. And one of the things is mentioned is Luchot HaEvan, which is listed here, which essentially would translate into a stone tablet, or, some people would say stone tablets. And then it says Wahatorah. Now, it's interesting that it says and the Torah, and the Torah. And then it says Waha mitzvah, which means and the mitzvah. So that tells you that there are three things that Moshe Rabbeinu was receiving. He was receiving Luchot HaEvan, he was receiving Torah, and then he was receiving a mitzvah. And the use of the Vav lets you know that these are three separate elements, three separate things here that he was receiving on Mount Sinai. So this is something that, lets us know, and we know that based on the definition of mitzvah, that this is like the pirush on the Torah, the written instruction. But we'll see that being defined by one of the rabbis we'll look at a little bit later. So then if we look in the Torah, there's a situation where this is one of the things that people quote as saying, well, there can't be an oral Torah because the written Torah says not to add or subtract from the Torah. And I showed this in a previous video that actually the written text that's being quoted there actually doesn't use the word Torah when it describes. It says, Lo tasifu ala davar asher anochi mitzawa atchem, v'lo tegora'u mimenu lishmor, at mitzvot Adonai Elohechem asher anochi mitzawa atchem. Translating this, it says that we're not allowed to add to the word, the davar. Now, the davar can be the word, the matter, or the thing, which Moshe Rabbeinu, which Asher Anochi Mitzvah Atchem, so which Moshe Rabbeinu orally transmitted, V'lo Dechora'u, so we're not supposed to take away from, and we're supposed to, to guard whatever he had given. And he says that there was mitzvot, which again is like, giving the idea of oral instruction that he had received from Hashem. And then he says that which he had commanded to the people of Israel. And not once in this particular, like verse, for example, is the word Torah used. So essentially what this means, and of course, no Jew who keeps Torah would ever consider changing the written text, but it's essential here to understand that what it's basically talking about is, on one hand, Moshe Rabbeinu wrote a written Torah, which we don't change. But on the other hand, there is an oral instruction that Moshe Rabbeinu gave that we don't change. And this instruction, for example, includes the judicial system, which has to come up with rulings based upon the circumstances that they're in. So, for example, we don't change the fact that we need to have judges. and then say we don't want judges, for example, that goes against the Torah. But a judge making a ruling for a generation is not a change to the Torah. It's simply the process the Torah tells us to use whenever there's a question that comes up. And that's something that's specifically mentioned in the Torah. Further, when we look in Deuteronomy 6 through 7, we see that, for example, fathers are commanded when it says, "Wishinantam levanecha v'dibarto bom." Essentially, what it says is that you will instruct your sons and you will speak with them or in this matter with them, for example. It says, "B'shivdecho b'fetecho v'letucho v'darecho v'shobecho v'gumecho." So essentially, when we're sitting in our homes, where we're on our way, and then we're also like laying down or rising. So essentially, this is also oral Torah. This means this is oral instruction. Because again, it's very specific. This is with the barto bom. It doesn't say v'katavta lo, like to write for him. It says like with the barto bom, which means to speak. So that means it's oral instruction. And then also in Yeshayahu, Isaiah 8:20, it says, "Lethorah welith'odon, im lo yamaru kadavar hazeh asher ein lo shohar." So essentially it says to the Torah and to the Teudah. And Teudah is a Hebrew word which, basically means either tradition, it either means, for example, revelation. It also is something that's an identifier. And it says, if something doesn't speak like these two things, like the Torah and the Teudah, there's no dawn in it, or it doesn't transition from darkness to light, So essentially, this is like, and it says it doesn't. If imlo yomoru kadavar hazeh, if it doesn't speak like this matter or this thing or this word, there's no dawn in it. So then, if we look in the Second Temple period and say, okay, well, can we find any, information that tells us that there was, let's say groups that were non-rabbinic, for example, and or even rabbinic, and say, is there any information from the Second Temple period that tells us that somebody was claiming back then that there was an oral Torah? So when we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essene community, or what we modernly call the Essene community, there's a number of information of studies that have been done of their writings, the writings that they left behind. And it's very clear from the writings that they left behind that they had also a concept of oral Torah. And you can read through this article here. It's called Oral Tradition in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it's basically by Shem Miller. And essentially, going through it, you can kind of, pause and look through yourself here. But one of the things he talks about in this particular, particular article about this is something that I've listed here in basically in the highlight, where he says, in Judaism in antiquity, meaning in ancient times, written texts were intrinsically connected with speech because in the majority of circumstances, reading was speaking. So essentially what that means is that if someone is trying to write something down, essentially what they're doing is taking something that had been spoken previously and then putting it into writing. But of course, there's no situation where someone can write in any form of detail to the level of someone explaining something, because there's only so much you can write. And even with explaining, someone could say, well, there's limitations to orally explaining something. But by orally explaining, there's a lot of things that a person can do. I mean, there's a lot of detail a person can get into. A person can answer questions that, for example, can't always be answered in the written form. There's inflections that a person can use when they're describing something. And then also there's the ability to physically show someone what you're talking about. So it'd be like, for example, saying, if you look throughout the Torah, it mentions different types of colors to be used for different types of things that are considered to be a requirement to do. But never does the written Torah actually describe any of these colors in like, physical description to where you'd be able to know like what color is what. I mean, a good example of this is that when you look at the tzitziot, the I guess you could say the strings that you see like Orthodox religious Jews wearing on the four corners of our garments. One of the things the Torah says is that one of the strings should be techelet, but it never describes what the color techelet even is. Now some people say, oh, it's obvious that it's blue. Ancient people would have known it's blue, but then in the book of Bereshit it uses the word kachol, which means blue. So then the question is, okay, what's the difference between kachol and techelet? Are they the exact same blue or are they different? The Torah never mentions that or describes it. And all the other various colors, in fact, many of the colors mentioned in the Torah for the Mishkan, for the tabernacle, are names of colors that we don't even use modernly, in modern Hebrew, for example. So this is one of the things that, we know that, in ancient times, there was always some form of oral transmission. So then if we look a little bit further into this article, it talks about like the Essene community, the Dead Sea Scrolls community, having hidden and revealed laws. And it says, for example, above, I argued, meaning the author, that the description of nightly study sessions in the community rule, which is the name of a document that's been given modernly of one of the documents found from the Dead Sea Scrolls community, portrays the ruling as an oral written text because it contained traditional interpretation transmitted by oral performance. In this section, I define the nature of this traditional interpretation and extend my argument towards Foley's taxonomy of oral traditional text. Although past scholarship has primarily understood the ruling as either community regulations or scripture, the ruling is best understood as an oral traditional text containing both oral performance and textual exegesis. More precisely, the ruling is a voice from the past constituted by a body of oral tradition conveying hidden and revealed laws. He continues, and later in his article describing this, and he says, according to the cultural memory of the Yachat, meaning that's what he essentially calls this community in the Dead Sea Scrolls community, the generations of old abandoned Hashem's covenant. As a punishment, Hashem himself hid himself from ancient Israel. And this is their interpretation, meaning that this is Yisrael Histir Panov, and essentially this is the Dead Sea Scrolls interpretation of their community's interpretation of their current situation in the Second Temple period. And the correct interpretation of the Torah was subsequently concealed from Israel. Davar hanistar mi Yisrael v'chol. But these bygone interpretations, although neglected, were not irreclaimable. Members of the Yachad could recover these formerly hidden laws, through reading and interpreting authoritative texts, activities that primarily occurred during community meetings. Consequently, all laws could be classified in one of two categories: the revealed, hanigalut, and the hidden, hanistorot. So essentially what that tells you is that the Dead Sea Scrolls community had their own form of oral Torah. And at some point they came to believe that there was things that were hidden, for example, that couldn't be derived directly from the written text of the Torah. And we know that obviously other things that they wrote outside of the Torah tells it that they had something that was outside of the written Torah that was essentially, you could say, it was oral Torah for them. And then, coming a bit later in the time period, we have this mosaic that had been found in Israel, and I think near the area of Beth Shean in the Shomron area. And essentially, this mosaic describes the body of Jewish law regulating the use of farm products grown in different regions. In Jewish tradition, certain laws are only applicable within the land of Israel proper, but delineating the boundaries of the land of Israel at that time, the mosaic seeks to establish the legal status of the country in its various parts from the time of the Jewish people's return from the Babylonian captivity. It describes whether or not local farm products acquired by Jews from various sources are exempt from the laws of the seventh year produce, and gives guidelines for dealing with produce with tithing status tithing status is uncertain. So this is also something, because if you look at the Torah itself, for example, it gives some element of what's supposed to be done when the Jews are supposed to enter the land of Israel, but it doesn't fully detail everything you would need to do once you establish a nation in the land of Israel, especially with the changes in borders that would happen. Because, again, this is something that's important for the legal system to exist and the temple system to exist in order to be able to deal with those issues. And, the idea of what is considered to be, the right process for this is something that is oral Torah. And as we'll see later in this video, that when you look at the written text, the way it would have looked several thousand years ago, there's no way around the fact that you have an oral Torah. So then this brings us to a very valuable question, because I've heard from certain people who claim that there's no oral Torah. They always say, just generally speaking, the rabbis say this, the rabbis say that. Now be aware that I'm going to quote several rabbis in just a moment, but what I'm saying is that all Jews who hold by the Torah, that you find amongst Yemenite Jews, amongst Mizrahi Jews, Sephardi Jews, Orthodox Jews, things of that nature. Essentially, everybody agrees with the information that these rabbis present, and that it might just be a matter of someone wording it a little bit differently. But at the core root of it, everybody agrees that they're describing something that our ancestors received at Mount Sinai, and it's not simply like some rabbis who are aloof from the Jewish community making a claim and then everybody just kind of buying into it. But it's more like people saying, "I agree with that claim because that's what my father and grandfather and so on, basically passed on to us." So if we go to Rav Saad Gaon, who lived between about 892 to 942 CE, he says, for example, in describing, essentially the issue of, what exactly is, the oral Torah, if you will, as well as the written Torah, he says, Ki asher katavti. This is from the Torah. He's basically saying, Davak im luchot ha'even, lo im Torah v'hamitzvah, ki Hashem lo katav rak esarat ha'devarim. ופירוש התורה, תורה שבכתב, והמצוות, תורה שבעל פה, כי כל המצוות ניתנו למשה בסיני בימים שעמד בהר, וכן כתוב ואתה פה עמוד עמודי. So essentially, what he basically describes is the difference between, what you have as the written Torah, when in the particular part of the Torah that discusses what I mentioned earlier, that says that there were three things that Moshe Rabbeinu received at Har Sinai, which is the Luchot Even, the stone tablets, as well as the Torah, which is the considered to be what would be eventually the written Torah, and then also the Mitzvah, which is the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah. So then going back to something I mentioned in one of my previous videos of Ibn Ezra, who lived about from 1089 to 1164 CE. And what he essentially mentions is that there's different types of people within the Jewish community, plural communities who have different expertise within like the Torah, for example. So there are some who have expertise in what he calls the Masoreth, which is the traditions about the text that is passed down from generation to generation. And then he says that this is like people have the expertise in Divrei Masoreth. But then he also mentions that there's some people who their expertise is Diyukot Haloshon, which is almost like saying the grammar, the spelling, things like that of the written text and what it means, which is again an element of oral Torah. And that's something that he explains later on, that there's no way to understand the written Torah without an oral Torah. And we'll see why that is a little bit later, which, essentially means that the educational system of what the letters are, what they sound like, and what the meanings are of them, and the relevance of something being spelled one way or the relevance of it being written a certain way is all, things that are considered oral Torah. And this is, again, another element because I've had some people claim, oh, well, you can't claim that the grammar is oral Torah, but this is rabbis have been saying for thousands of years, and Jews in the Jewish community say that it is, 100% is. That's an element of oral Torah. So then, if we look at the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, in his introduction to the Mishnah Torah, and he says the following: "Kol mitzvot shenotanu leMoshe b'Sinai b'Firushan nitonu shene'amaru atana lecho et luchot ha'even v'haTorah v'hamitzvot Torah zo Torah shebichtav ומצוות זה פירושו, וציוונו לעשות התורה על פי המצוות, ומצווה זו היא הנקראת תורה שבעל פה. So essentially what he says is that, every one of the mitzvot that Moshe Rabbeinu, received at Mount Sinai came along with an explanation of what they, were and what they mean. So he says that this is found in, Exodus 24:12, where it says that, that Moshe Rabbeinu was given the stone tablets, which you mentioned earlier, the Torah, and the mitzvah. And that the Torah is representing what eventually will become the written Torah, for example, and the mitzvah is the explanation of the written Torah. And he says we are commanded to do the Torah, meaning what will eventually be the written text, per the mitzvah. And the mitzvah in this particular part of the Torah is essentially what we call nowadays Torah Sheba'al Peh, or oral Torah. So this word here denotes oral Torah. So whenever there's people who will say, okay, well, I don't see the oral Torah anywhere in the written text, this word here is describing it. Because again, what you would have to say is, okay, when it says Luchot Even, I think most people can agree on that. When it says Torah, someone says, okay, well, that only means written text. The word Torah only means written text. So then what does this mean? Does the mitzvah also in written text? And where does it describe that as a written text? Now, I mentioned this in another video, that eventually when it says that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the Torah to completion, it never uses this word. It only uses Torah in singular, even though later in the Torah, as I mentioned in another video, that the word Torah is in some cases plural, Toroth, and it only says he wrote Torah Tatzot, which means like this Torah, but it never mentions that he wrote down a mitzvah. So continuing with the Rambam, he states a little bit later in his introduction to the Mishnah Torah, והמצווה שהיא פירוש התורה לא כתבו, אלא ציווה בה לזקנים ולישוע ולשאר כל ישראל, שנאמר, את כל הדבר אשר אנוכי מצווה אתכם, אותו תשמרו לעשות, from דברים י"ג א', ומפני זה נקראת תורה שבעל פה. So essentially what he says here is that the mitzvah that we mentioned earlier in that particular verse, that is like the pirush in the Torah, meaning that that's the, if you will, the explanation of the mitzvah. So it's like saying if there are 613 mitzvah in the Torah, and please note, there are some people who say that there's no oral Torah. They also say that there's 613 mitzvah of the Torah, but there's nowhere in the written Torah that says that there's 613 mitzvot of the Torah. Again, that comes from oral Torah. Now, it'd be like saying the following: for each of those 613 mitzvot, that are mentioned in the Torah. There's an explanation of exactly how to do them and how to make rulings, on them. So, for example, when we talk about the colors that I mentioned earlier, that nowhere in the Torah does it actually give a physical description of pretty much most of the colors, if not all of them, for example. But then the Oral Torah explains, well, what color is what and where you can find that color. And, for example, it'd be like someone pointing out, okay, Techelet is that color right there, and we can get it from that source over there. This Tolat Shani, is this color over here. We can get it from this thing over here. And that's what the Oral Torah would explain. And essentially what he's saying is that, that was passed on to the Zekanim, the leaders of, the Jewish community, of the Israeli community, Yehoshua ben Nun, who was a student of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Joshua, as people say in English, and to the remainders of the people of Israel. And Rambam explains in another place that it started, for example, with the leaders of each of the different tribes, as well as the leaders of subsections of those tribes. And that this is basically, talked about in the book of Deuteronomy 13:1, where it says, that the matter or the word, again, hadavar, which, the Moshe Rabbeinu says, I command to you, to keep that thing and to do. And then it says, mipaneze, that's for this reason, it's basically called Torah Sheba'al Peh. So again, this word here in the Torah, when it has the word mitzvah, every time that word is used, in pretty much like all cases, it's talking about an oral command. Now, in terms of Torah Sheba'al Peh, it's a mitzvah that was never written down. So we have no description of a lot of mitzvot in the Torah of actually how to physically do them. And we'll see an example of that just in a little bit. So looking at the Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, who lived a little bit after the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman lived from 1194 to 1270, and his commentary on the Torah in his introduction to Bereshit or the Genesis, he says, "V'chol ne'amsar leMoshe Rabbeinu b'sha'arei havina hakol nichtav b'Torah b'pirush o beremiza b'tivot או בגימטריה, או בצורת האותיות, בכתובות כהלכתן, או במשתנות בצורתן, כגון הלפפות והמקימות וזלותן, או בקוצי האותיות וכתוריהן, כי הרמזים האלו לא יתבוננו, אלא מפה על פה ad Moshe Messina. So what he explains is the following, is that essentially there's like 50, if you will, these different, he says like different gates of understanding. He mentions earlier in his text, there's like these 50 different gates of understanding, if you will. And he says that, all that's like in the written Torah. Or it's inside of, like what's basically like a kind of a hint, in the way that, for example, the way the text is written, whether you can do like some kind of mathematical, computations of the Torah, something's written this way here, it comes to this calculation, and then it matches something written over here, which has a similar calculation. He says in the shape of the letters, for example, the spacings and things like that. And then he says like, for example, the changes in the shape of the letters, things like that. And also he mentions, for example, that there's like, like little things on the top of the letters sometimes that allow us to know that there's different meanings there. And he, for example, at the end says that the remez, which is almost like the hint, or, kind of the, if you will, I guess you could almost say like not exactly secret meaning, but there's like more of a meaning to something than what you see there. He says all of that is something that, was passed down from mouth to, mouth or, passed down orally, from the time of the Moshe at Sinai, from the time that Moses was at Mount Sinai. Essentially, those things were taught, because again, there's things that are messages in the written text that someone who doesn't know Hebrew would never notice because of the fact that, again, you'd have to read the text. And there's some things that somebody would not notice unless they're actually looking at a Torah scroll that was copied in the same way that Moshe Rabbeinu copied his Torah scroll when he received it from Hashem. And then lastly, in this particular section, in Rabbi Eden Steinsaltz, who wrote in his commentary of the Talmud, he had a reference guide that he wrote. He mentions the following. He says, each generation received knowledge of divine revelation and passed it on to the next. Some things were written down and others remained in the oral tradition. Certain things were exceedingly hard to explain either orally or in writing and had to be taken as axiomatic. The sum of one generation's knowledge of revelation is known as the Torah of that generation, and its transmission to the following generation is well known, Shalshelet HaKabbalah, chain of tradition. So this gives us, I would say, a full, complete kind of understanding of what we're talking about when we take into account everything that we've read before. So again, this all the information you've seen presented here is things that are basically agreed upon by all the communities you see here. So if, for example, you have one particular person who's on the outskirts of, outside of all of this, who's on their own, and let's say that their father doesn't agree with them, their grandfather doesn't agree with them, and so on and so on. And then they're talking about, like something that they say is true. The basic issue is that all of these communities you see here listed here agree upon the national revelation at Mount Sinai, the written Torah, and sources of the oral Torah. So this tells you that, I would say, speaking for all of these communities here, everyone here claims that their ancestors received an oral Torah, and they are enough to speak for, their ancestry, as compared to someone who, for example, has no proof that their ancestry was wrong about there being an oral Torah. So then this begs the question, if there's no oral Torah, then how does one do this? So I'm going to present something to you. This right here. This is a section of the Torah. Now, I'm not going to say words from. I'm going to simply leave it to those who watch the video, especially those who know Hebrew. And I'm going to simply say, okay, if you don't know how to read this and you don't know how to pronounce anything here, if you don't know where, for example, to start a sentence or where to end it, then you have a problem because the written text never explains any of this. So, for example, obviously this gap here lets us know that there's some difference between what's here and what's here. Now, what that difference is, the written Torah never explains what the difference is. So one question a person can face is, how do I know that this is the exact methodology that, when Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah and wrote the Torah, that he had gaps here? Because the gap being here or not being here can change the meaning of the text. As an example, obviously, one way I could look at this and say, well, this obviously starts a new sentence. But the problem is that there's no punctuation to tell me where to stop. So maybe I stop right here. Maybe from here, and remember, Hebrew's written from right to left, which the written Torah never explains that that's how we read Hebrew. We read it from right to left. Starting here and ending here, I could say this whole thing's a sentence. Or I can say that a sentence starts here and maybe, like, for example, ends, maybe here or here. And each time I say that it stops and starts somewhere, it could change the meaning. Let me give you one quick example that we'll look into in just a second. This word here. This word here can be goel or gaal. And in English, one way to translate it, you could translate it as someone who's like a deliverer. But the other end, someone you could say someone, you could translate it as someone who is taking on financial responsibility for someone. Well, obviously, a deliverer in English means something different than someone who, for example, is taking financial responsibility for someone. Most people who say, okay, well, that's my advocate, or that's, someone who's, helping me financially, they don't call them you delivered me in most cases in English. Delivery usually means something a bit more mystical if you want. So that's one thing. The word, depending on, which one it is, can mean two different things. Another example, for example, is this word here. This word here could be several things, and we'll look specifically at this word. But then before we get to this word, let's look at this word here. This word here can be ha'odef or it can be ha'adif. If it's odef usually means something left over, like you have spare change. That's usually in the modern Hebrew called odef. But if it's adif means prefer. So the question is, okay, if it's odif, that can change the meaning of everything that's written here. If it's adif, it can change the meaning too. If it's like spare change or what's left over, that means one thing. If it's preferred, that means something different. So now let's look into this word here, just one word here, and see that without an oral Torah, we would have no way of knowing what this word actually is, how it's pronounced, and what it actually means. And we'll see that in just a second. So let's look at this. Let's take this word here. The first challenge I'd say any non-Hebrew speaker would have, or even someone who knows Hebrew, is how exactly do I pronounce these consonants or these vowels? Now, the issue is that they're consonants. Ancient Hebrew didn't have a system of showing, the vowels. The vowels were orally understood, meaning you orally learn what they were. So let's take this word and look at the different variations of what it could be, based upon, like actual known Hebrew. So if this word is chashav, then that carries the meaning of he thought, he considered, he intended, he esteemed. That's if the pronunciation is chashav, or in ancient Hebrew, hoshav. But that changes the minute that you have a different pronunciation of the word, which is chishev. Chishev means he thinks, he considers, I'm sorry, choshev. Choshev means that, he thinks, he considers, he intends, he esteems. Now, modern Hebrew, usually there's a vowel that's added here called a wob or vav. Now, in ancient Hebrew, vav wasn't always used or wav wasn't always placed there. So if this is hoshev, means present tense, he thinks, he considers, he intends, he esteems. Where if it was hoshav or hashav, Basically, it means he thought, he considered, he intended. So this is the difference between present tense and past tense. Either one can be written in the exact same way, and you would have no way of knowing it based on the written text which one it's supposed to be. So then if we continue and say, okay, well, there's another way it can be pronounced. This one is Hishev, which would means he calculated past tense, it calculated past tense. And again, Hishev is different than Hoshev, it's different than Hoshav. So essentially, these three meanings have different meanings to them. But then it's not that's not the only thing it could be. It could be this one here, which would be, basically Hushav. Hushav could mean he was calculated, it was calculated. So again, Hushav, Hishev, Hoshev, Hoshav, or Hashav. So again, and again, what's important here is Holshav, for example, with this one, means that there's a certain, like, for example, vowel that would have to be under this letter when it's written out. But in ancient times, they didn't have a written system of vowels. This one being Holshev, for example, the sometimes people in modern Hebrew pronounce the sound that would be under here as the same as this, when in ancient Hebrew would be Holshav, or like a all here. And this would be Holshev, the shev. And again, they carry different meanings. And this one being Hushav, which would mean he was calculated, it was calculated. But then there's also another option. And again, the colors aren't important. I'm just using the colors to denote the different pronunciations that lead to different meanings. So it could be Hishav or Hishov. Hishav or Hishov would mean you will calculate, meaning it's a command, meaning that you must do something, which is different in meaning from something that is like he did something past tense, he was something past tense, he is like considering something, thinking something, he thought something past tense. All of these could have been what that word in the written text of the Torah could have been, but the written text never gives an idea of exactly which one it is. And in fact, if we go back to this page here, actually, if you look at the actual written text, even if someone were to claim, oh, if by context you would know. Well, again, it could be several of these, at least by the context. The context here could actually be that it is, like, for example, he like thought. It could also be he calculated. It could be you will calculate, for example, as a command, and it still fits within the context of what's written here. And again, the context can change if this word is odif or adif. And again, the only way to have known any of this, because this written text never explains any of the things I just told you. It doesn't explain what all the different options of pronunciation are. And again, the different pronunciations can give a different meaning for what this is even talking about. So again, it's only by oral tradition that we have that understanding that this is hishav, meaning that you will calculate. But one thing that the text never explains is who's the one doing the calculating. Because essentially, just to give you an idea, what this is talking about is if you have a Jew who has a certain like land right, which is the achuz otho, which is mentioned here, and he sells it because of the fact that he's in very bad straits. And it talks about the issue of, for example, he wants to redeem it. But then it says, also talks about, okay, what if he can't redeem it? What if like, who can redeem it for him? And it talks about a family member of his from his tribe, for example, can redeem it for him. But then it says, okay, well, what if, for example, he and the person like, who he sold it to, have, this agreement that they're going to make of, returning it back to the person who it originally belongs to. Well, then it talks about being a calculation being done, for example, that, is, dealing with the rest of what the person owes. But again, all of this is Torah Shabbat Peh because it never answers the question of who does the calculation or even what's the calculation. And this word here, what hishav, is talking about a calculation. But again, we're never told what the math is supposed to be on this issue. And if this is adif, it changes the meaning, rather if it's odif. So this completely changes the meaning, and you will require an oral Torah. And what I would do as an example is this: ask someone who's like, for example, against the oral Torah, and take this section and just ask them the questions I'm mentioning here. Where do I start? Where do I stop? How do I know that this word is this rather than something else? And if they pull out, like, let's say a chumash that has like all the vowels there, and they say, well, it's hishav, well, hishav, then essentially it's like, well, wait a minute, how do you know that? That's because someone wrote down those vowels and created them 1,500 years ago. But how did they create it? They created it based on oral Torah. So in conclusion, as I mentioned before, the idea of, what exactly is Torah Shabbat Peh. And again, there are elements of the Torah Shabbat Peh that deal with all the different aspects of how we understand how to actually do the written Torah. That can include, how the text is written. That can include the grammar. That can include the judgments that have been made on it. That also includes what has been passed down from generation to generation. Because let's be clear, the people who would have the best understanding of like what the Torah was at Mount Sinai would be people who lived during that time. But again, if they only if the only thing that they left behind was just the written Torah, then we're lacking in that area. But of course, we know that Torah Shabbat Peh continued. And because of the fact that they were living the tradition, because that's one of the things people don't sometimes understand, is that, well, isn't it like broken telephone that everybody would have a different understanding? Well, the reasoning is no, because again, they had 40 years to train in how to do the Torah. They had 40 years to learn from Moshe Rabbeinu the Torah. But then every generation had Nevi'im, prophets, who, if there was a situation where the people weren't doing something correctly, Hashem provided a prophet to be able to get people on the right track. But even further than that is if you think about what's called in English muscle memory, meaning that when a person does something over and over and over again, there is an element of muscle memory that comes along with it. You can go to any Jew who keeps Torah today and ask them, for example, about Shabbat. Take a Jew, for example, who grew up in a Jewish community, whose grandfather and father, for example, taught them Torah, and that they've been doing Shabbat ever since they were born. You ask them a basic question about Shabbat, most of them know where to get an answer, if not already have the answer to give you to begin with, because of the fact that it's something they've been living. It's no different than taking an athlete and, say, for example, calling out a certain play, let's say with football. There's certain plays, and it's like in football, there's a lot of different plays that, that have been come up with, but there are players who know the plays because they live those things out. And it's something they do on a day-to-day basis. So we'll say, well, how do you know that this play actually means for the running back to go this way or the right wide receiver to do that? Well, we've been playing the game long enough and we've been talking to coach long enough to where it's pretty much instinct. We know what we're doing because we've been doing this for so long. So this is the base explanation of how rabbis define Torah Shabbat Peh. So if you're ever in a conversation or in a debate or something like that with someone who's a missionary, these are the kind of things I would think personally, and this is my personal opinion, that should be brought up because of the fact that they often will say things against the Oral Torah, but they never will be honest or specific about what they're talking about. And then they'll never accept the idea that the rabbis say certain things about it that they don't want to agree with. So they want to kind of keep this idea of Oral Torah as this open thing that can be whatever they say it is, for example, but they never will want to get into the very specifics. So this again is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Take care and thank you for listening and bye.